Hello, and welcome to the World War Lab channel. Today, we're diving into a moment that reveals how wars are not only decided by battles and bravery, but by something far more fragile and decisive: fuel. December 17th, 1944, 0530 hours. Hansfeld, Belgium. The engine of the Tiger tank coughed violently, sputtered, and then fell silent. SS Obersturmführer Joachim Peiper slammed his fist against the turret hatch, the metallic impact echoing through the frozen pre-dawn air. Inside the hull, his driver, Anders Weber, tried once more to restart the massive 700 horsepower Maybach engine. Nothing happened. The fuel gauge was pinned to empty. From below, Weber called out, his voice tight with barely restrained panic, that the reserve tank was also dry. Peiper climbed down from his command tank, his boots crunching against the hard, frozen Belgian soil. All around him sat the most powerful armored spearhead the Wehrmacht had assembled for Operation Watch on the Rhine, the Ardennes offensive. 67 tanks, 149 half-tracks, and nearly 5,000 of Germany's most elite Waffen-SS soldiers were completely immobilized, not by enemy fire, but by empty fuel tanks. Through the thinning morning mist, Peiper could see the abandoned American position ahead of them at Hansfeld, a critical supply depot for the U.S. 99th Infantry Division. The Americans had fled in such haste that oil drum fires were still burning. Coffee sat warm in metal cups, and there, lined up like an offering from the gods of war themselves, stood endless rows of jerry cans, thousands of them, the unmistakable olive-drab American fuel containers. Peiper approached the stockpile slowly, almost reverently. His adjutant, Hauptsturmführer Hans Gruber, pried open one of the cans and sniffed the contents. High-octane gasoline. As the realization spread, his men erupted into frantic motion, rushing to refuel their vehicles with American fuel. Peiper walked among the stockpile, counting, calculating. The numbers were staggering. Nearly 50,000 gallons. Enough to fuel his entire battle group for the push to the Meuse River. Enough to potentially alter the course of the entire offensive. The Americans had abandoned more fuel in this single depot than most German divisions had received in the previous 6 months. But as Peiper stood amid this sudden bounty, watching American fuel pour into German tanks, a crushing realization settled over him like the fog drifting across the field. If the Americans could afford to abandon fuel in such quantities, if they could leave behind what Germany would guard with entire divisions, then the war was already lost. Germany had not merely miscalculated. Germany had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of its enemy. 6 months earlier, in June 1944, Albert Speer, Hitler's Minister of Armaments and War Production, had presented the Führer with a report that should have ended all offensive operations immediately. Germany's synthetic fuel production, the lifeblood of the Wehrmacht, had been systematically annihilated by Allied bombing. The Luna Works, which had produced 175,000 tons of fuel in April, managed barely 5,000 tons by September. The massive hydrogenation plants at Politz, Blechhammer, and Brucks were operating at less than 10% of their capacity. The numbers told a story that could not be escaped. Defeat was inevitable. In 1944, the United States produced 1.8 billion barrels of crude oil. Germany, including all synthetic production and captured Romanian oil fields, managed only 33 million barrels, less than 2% of American output. The Third Reich was trying to fight a modern, mechanized war with logistics that were closer to the age of horses and engines. While America was drowning its armies in petroleum abundance, Germany was rationing every drop. Major Friedrich Simmer of the Wehrmacht's Logistics Command had calculated that the Ardennes offensive would require 4.5 million gallons of fuel just to reach Antwerp. Hitler allocated 5 million gallons, but only half of that ever reached the front because of transportation breakdowns and Allied air attacks. The German High Command was gambling the entire offensive on capturing enemy fuel supplies, a strategy that revealed terminal weakness rather than strength. The Americans, meanwhile, had built a logistical machine that bordered on the unbelievable. Across France, they constructed the Pluto system, pipeline under the ocean, pumping fuel directly from England. They operated the Red Ball Express, a massive truck convoy network that delivered 12,500 tons of supplies every single day to the front. By December 1944, American forces in Europe were consuming 1.2 million gallons of fuel per day and receiving 1.4 million gallons. They were not only sustaining their operations, they were building reserves while fighting. Joachim Peiper understood this reality all too well. At just 29 years old, he was one of the youngest regimental commanders in the Waffen-SS. He was a holder of the Knight's Cross with oak leaves and swords, a veteran of the Eastern Front, where he had learned the brutal truth of modern warfare. Fuel was more valuable than ammunition. His battle group had been designated the Schwerpunkt, the decisive point of the entire Ardennes offensive. On December 14th, 2 days before the attack, Peiper attended the final briefing at Tondorf. General Sepp Dietrich, commander of the 6th SS Panzer Army, spoke bluntly. Peiper would have enough fuel to reach the Meuse only if he captured American supplies along the way. The fuel allocation for Camp Grupp Peiper was 31,000 gallons, enough for approximately 50 miles of combat operations. The distance to the Meuse River was 65 miles. The mathematics of failure were embedded in the plan from the very beginning. As his column prepared to advance on December 16th, Peiper issued strict orders. Tanks were operated in single file to conserve fuel. Engines would be shut off during any halt longer than 5 minutes. The capture of American fuel dumps was priority number one, even above tactical objectives. Without fuel, nothing else mattered. The contrast with American operations could not have been sharper. That same morning, Captain James Rose of the U.S. 743rd Tank Battalion, stationed just 20 miles from Peiper's starting position, recorded in his unit diary, received fuel resupply 8,000 gallons. Third delivery this week. Storage tanks already at capacity. December 16th, 1944. 0530 hours. The German artillery barrage that opened Operation Watch on the Rhine consumed more ammunition in 2 hours than the Wehrmacht had allocated for entire operations earlier in the war. It was an awe-inspiring display of firepower. Yet even this spectacle concealed the fatal shortages beneath the surface. As the thunder of artillery faded into the distance, Peiper's column began to move. By 7 o'clock in the morning, they were already behind schedule. The roads that appeared on German maps as proper highways turned out to be nothing more than narrow country lanes, many of them unpaved. Within hours, massive traffic jams formed as vehicles built for the open expanses of the Russian steppes struggled to force their way through the dense Ardennes forest. At Landsrath, Peiper's first objective, they ran into resistance that no one had anticipated. A single American intelligence and reconnaissance platoon. Just 18 men held up the most powerful armored column in the German army for nearly 10 hours. During that delay, Peiper's vehicles sat with engines running, burning irreplaceable fuel. By the time they finally broke through and reached Hansfeld at dawn on December 17th, Peiper's column had advanced only 20 miles and had already consumed 40% of its fuel. At that rate, they would run dry before even reaching the halfway point to the Meuse. The American supply depot at Hansfeld was not even considered a major installation. It was merely a forward supply point for the 99th Infantry Division, classified by the U.S. Army as a Class 3B depot, a temporary fuel station. Yet what Peiper discovered there exceeded the monthly fuel allocation for an entire German panzer division. His adjutant, Hans Gruber, later testified, "We found pyramids of jerry cans, each holding 5 gallons of gasoline. They were stacked 3 meters high and stretched for perhaps 200 meters. The Americans had not even tried to destroy them. The captured fuel was high-octane aviation gasoline mixed with motor fuel of 80 octane or higher. German vehicles, especially the sensitive Maybach engines and the Tiger tanks, were designed for 74-octane fuel. Ironically, the American gasoline was too good, causing engine problems in several German vehicles. As the refueling continued, Even more discoveries followed. Sergeant Wilhelm Hoffman found shipping manifests in the depot office. He could read English, having worked in his father's import business before the war. The documents showed that the fuel had been shipped from Texas to New York, then across the Atlantic to Liverpool, across the English Channel to Normandy, and finally trucked more than 400 miles to Hansfeld, a journey of over 6,000 miles, completed in less than 6 weeks. I showed the papers to Obersturmbannführer Peiper. Hoffman recalled in a 1976 interview. He read them twice, then crushed them in his hand. He said nothing, but his face turned pale. We both understood what it meant. Private Ernst Karrer found a stack of Stars and Stripes newspapers dated December 15th, only 2 days old. The headline announced the opening of a new fuel pipeline from Cherbourg to Verdun capable of delivering 300,000 gallons per day. A single pipeline providing more fuel daily than Kampfgruppe Peiper would use during the entire offensive. To understand the shock of what Peiper had discovered, one must grasp the reality of Germany's fuel situation by late 1944. Since May, Allied bombing had reduced synthetic fuel production by 90%. The Luftwaffe was grounding aircraft because aviation fuel simply did not exist. Pilot training had been cut from 250 flight hours to just 60. The German Navy surface fleet had effectively ceased operations. U-boats were being fitted with snorkels so they could conserve diesel by running longer on batteries. On the home front, German civilians had not seen private automobile traffic since 1942. Gasoline was so valuable that the Gestapo investigated black market thefts measured in single liters. Farmers were returning to horse-drawn plows. At the same time, the United States was producing 67% of the world's oil. The East Texas oil field alone produced more petroleum than all of German-occupied Europe combined. American refineries were running at such capacity that Standard Oil was experimenting with new petroleum byproducts simply because they had more crude than they knew what to do with. With the 50,000 gallons captured at Hansfeld, Peiper's column surged forward. By noon on December 17th, they reached Bullingen, where they seized additional supplies, rations, ammunition, and most importantly, maps showing other American fuel depots in the region. But those maps revealed a deeply unsettling truth. The Americans had fuel stockpiles everywhere. Every major crossroads had its own depot. The U.S. First Army alone held 3.5 million gallons in reserve. Peiper pushed onward to Lignaville, where his forces would carry out the Malmedy massacre, murdering 84 American prisoners of war. Even this atrocity was bound to fuel desperation. Peiper later claimed he could not spare the gasoline required to transport prisoners to the rear. By the evening of December 17th, Peiper's spearhead reached Stavelot, the site of a massive American fuel depot holding more than 2 million gallons of gasoline. Here was enough fuel to guarantee a breakthrough to the Meuse. But as the first German vehicles approached, American engineers were already taking action. Captain John Brewster of the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion had been warned of the German advance. His orders were simple: deny the fuel to the enemy at all costs. The Stavelot depot contained 2,189,000 gallons of gasoline and jerry can spread across 15 acres. At 16:30 on December 17th, as Peiper's advance guard drew near, Captain Brewster gave the order. Engineers poured trails of gasoline between the stacks. White phosphorus grenades were handed out. Technical Sergeant Paul Solis threw the first grenade. The explosion was immediate and tremendous, he later recalled. A wall of fire shot up maybe 100 feet. Within minutes, the entire depot was a roaring inferno. When Peiper's lead tanks arrived, they found a colossal column of black smoke rising 1,000 feet into the sky. The fire would burn for 3 days, consuming enough fuel to have powered Peiper's entire division to Antwerp and back. Unterst Scharfer, Weber described the scene later. The Obersturmbannführer stood on his tank turret, watching the flames. He said nothing for maybe 5 minutes. Then he climbed down and told me, "They can afford to burn 2 million gallons just to keep it from us. What are we doing here?" Across the Ardennes, American engineers were destroying their own fuel dumps rather than risk their capture. At Ardennes, 1.1 million gallons were burned. At Spa, 2.5 million gallons were destroyed. In total, the Americans deliberately destroyed more than 8 million gallons of fuel in the first week alone, more than Germany had allocated for the entire. The operation continued. The ability to casually destroy millions of gallons of fuel was rooted in a supply system that was beyond anything the Germans could comprehend. The Red Ball Express alone had already delivered 412,000 tons of supplies, using more than 6,000 trucks running day and night without pause. Each truck burned roughly 40 gallons of fuel per day. The logistics operation itself consumed more fuel than German Army Group B received in an entire month. By December 1944, the Motor Transport Service employed 230 truck companies operating along carefully planned, color-coded routes. This massive system was delivering 20,000 tons of supplies every day, including 3,000 tons of fuel. Colonel James Snyder, Chief Logistics Officer for the U.S. First Army, recorded in his log on December 18th. Fuel received yesterday, 1,847,000 gallons. Fuel issued, 1,623,000 gallons. Net gain to reserves, 224,000 gallons. Even while fighting one of the largest battles in history, the Americans were still building fuel reserves. The pipeline system was even more astonishing. Operation Pluto had laid pipelines across the English Channel, pumping 1 million gallons of fuel per day directly from Britain. From there, a network of pipelines pushed fuel deep into France. The Cherbourg, Paris line alone delivered 800,000 gallons daily. The Seine line moved another 650,000 gallons per day. By December 1944, Allied forces in Northwest Europe were consuming 7.5 million gallons of fuel each day, while receiving more than 8.2 million gallons. They were stockpiling fuel in the middle of a massive offensive. As Peiper pushed deeper into Belgium on December 18th, the impossibility of the German situation became undeniable. At Ardennes, his forces captured yet another depot, but 5,000 gallons were burned in just 3 hours of combat. Tiger tanks consumed about 2.5 gallons per mile in battle. Panthers burned roughly 1.5 gallons per mile. In the harsh terrain of the Ardennes, fuel consumption increased by as much as 40%. Hauptsturmführer Otto Dingler, maintenance officer for the 1st SS Panzer Regiment, recorded, "By noon on December 18th, we had consumed 67,000 gallons since the offensive began. We had captured perhaps 55,000 gallons. We were operating at a deficit. Even when they captured fuel, they were still falling behind." The Americans knew this. Through ultra-intercepts, they were reading German radio traffic and tracking Peiper's desperate situation. General Courtney Hodges issued a clear order to all units. Enemy critically short of fuel. Destroy all gasoline stocks threatened by capture. That same day, American C-47 transport planes flew 316 sorties to deliver supplies to the surrounded garrison at Bastogne, including 160,000 gallons of fuel. The Americans were flying more fuel into a trapped town than Peiper's entire camp group possessed. By December 19th, as Peiper's forces fought defenders at Stavelot, the fuel crisis had become catastrophic. Tanks were being abandoned not because they were damaged, but because their fuel tanks were empty. Peiper gathered what remained of his fuel supply, perhaps 8,000 gallons in total. It was enough for one final battle or retreat, but not both. At the same time, Allied planners were already looking ahead. Brigadier General Morris Gillen submitted a request for 245 million gallons of fuel for January operations. The request was approved without debate. The contrast between the two sides could not have been more absolute. It was not only a matter of quantity, but of efficiency. American vehicles were designed for standardized logistics. A Sherman tank consumed only 0.8 gallons per mile, compared to the Tiger's 2.5 gallons. American trucks averaged 8 miles per gallon, even when fully loaded. Spare parts were interchangeable, maintenance was simplified, and supply chains were streamlined. German forces, by contrast, operated a chaotic mixture of vehicles. Captured French tanks required different lubricants than German Panthers. Soviet trucks needed different spare parts than German Opels. Each vehicle type added another layer of complexity. Every difference multiplied their logistical nightmare. On December 20th, Peiper received a radio message that crushed any remaining hope. A fuel convoy had been destroyed by Allied aircraft. No resupply was possible. He was ordered to continue operations using whatever resources he had left. Peiper called the commanders together. Standard and Führer Werner Portner was brutally honest. "We have fuel for perhaps 20 kilometers. The Meuse is 30 kilometers away." According to Hans Gruber's later testimony, Peiper spoke quietly to the assembled officers. "Gentlemen, we have discovered that we are fighting an enemy who burns more fuel to deny it to us than we receive for this entire operation. What we captured at Hansfeld, which seemed like a miracle, was nothing to them. We cannot win." This realization was spreading throughout the German command. General Otto von Manschenfeld, commander of the 5th Panzer Army, later wrote, "When I learned that the Americans had destroyed 8 million gallons of fuel rather than risk our capturing it, I knew the offensive had failed before it truly began." Colonel Friedrich von der Heydt, captured on December 23rd, told his American interrogators, "Your soldiers throw away chocolate. My men have not seen chocolate in 2 years. You burn millions of gallons of fuel. We measure by the liter. How can we fight such abundance?" By December 21st, Peiper was surrounded near Gleize. His tanks were immobilized, not destroyed, but useless. The American forces encircling him, the 31st Infantry Division, the 82nd Airborne Division, and the 3rd Armored Division, had a combined fuel allocation of 340,000 gallons for December 21st alone. Peiper had perhaps 1,000 gallons left. Private First Class Richard McKinney wrote home, "We got Germans surrounded who ran out of gas. Our captain jokes that we use more fuel heating coffee than they have for their tanks." The American response demonstrated industrial warfare at its absolute peak. Patton's 3rd Army pivot northward required 350,000 gallons of fuel just for redeployment. By German standards, such a maneuver would have been impossible. The Americans accomplished it in 3 days. On December 23rd, the weather finally cleared. Allied aircraft filled the skies, flying 2,000 sorties in a single day. Each aircraft burned fuel at rates that would have grounded the Luftwaffe for weeks. P-47 Thunderbolts consumed 300 gallons per hour. B-26 Marauders burned 200 gallons per hour. 1 day of Allied air operations used more fuel than Germany had allocated for the entire Ardennes offensive. On the night of December 23rd to 24th, Peiper abandoned his remaining vehicles and escaped on foot. Of the 119 tanks and assault guns that had begun the offensive, only 39 remained operational. Yet they stood immobilized, silent monuments to a campaign that had been defeated not by firepower alone, but by mathematics, industry, and fuel. These vehicles were destroyed with their remaining ammunition. Obersturmführer Heinz Gall described the scene later. "We drained the last fuel from all the vehicles, maybe 200 gallons in total. The Obersturmbannführer personally destroyed his command tank. Millions of Reichsmarks worth of equipment reduced to scrap because there was no fuel. Out of 5,000 men who had begun the offensive with Kampfgruppe Peiper, only about 770 returned. They had advanced 60 miles, captured several supply depots, and in the process uncovered the truth about Allied logistics. News of what Peiper had seen spread quickly through the German command structure. On December 26th, Field Marshal Walter Model received detailed reports about the captured and destroyed American fuel stocks. His chief of staff recorded Model's reaction. The Field Marshal read the figures twice. 50,000 gallons at Hansfeld, 2 million gallons burned at Stavelot. 8 million gallons deliberately destroyed rather than allowed to fall into German hands. Then he said quietly, "We are not fighting the same war." Hitler, informed on December 28th, refused to accept the reality. Albert Speer later wrote, "Hitler insisted the numbers were propaganda. When shown photographs of the burning at Stavelot, he claimed they were Hollywood effects." But the lower ranks understood. Wilhelm Hoffmann wrote to his wife, "The Americans destroy more fuel in a day than we receive in a month. They drive tanks the way we march. This war is lost." The fuel crisis was only a symptom of a much larger truth. By 1944, America produced roughly 50% of the world's total manufacturing output. One aircraft every 5 minutes. One ship every day. One tank every 7 minutes. The petroleum statistics were even more overwhelming. The United States produced 1.8 billion barrels of oil. The Soviet Union produced about 110 million barrels. Germany, including all synthetic production, managed only 33 million barrels. Japan produced just 2.6 million barrels. The entire Axis combined produced less than 2% of American petroleum output. Every major German offensive after 1942 had been constrained by fuel shortages. Every American offensive was sustained by an abundance that German planners could not even imagine. Lieutenant Colonel Chester Hansen recorded a revealing moment on December 27th. A logistics officer reported that bad weather had reduced fuel deliveries to only 500,000 gallons per day. There was brief concern until someone pointed out that this still exceeded Germany's total fuel allocation for its entire Ardennes offensive. German prisoners taken in the Ardennes were often more shocked by American waste than by American firepower. Seeing GIs throw away half-eaten rations or use gasoline for heating broke their morale more deeply than artillery barges. One soldier, Gustav Reichel, told his interrogators, "We knew your production numbers in theory, but seeing soldiers waste more than we possessed made them real. Every German who witnessed your casual abundance knew the war was hopeless." This realization spread through letters home, despite censorship. Gefreiter Ernst Muller wrote, "Americans wash clothes in gasoline. They feed chocolate to dogs. They fire artillery for Christmas. We cannot fight infinity." The psychological impact was devastating. It shattered the narrative of racial and cultural superiority. How could the supposedly decadent Americans possess such limitless wealth while the so-called master race scraped for basic necessities? During the Nuremberg trials, German leaders repeatedly pointed to logistics, especially fuel, as the decisive factor. Field Marshal Keitel testified, "We had operational superiority in 1940 and 1941. By 1944, we could not move forces for lack of fuel, while the Americans moved armies like chess pieces." Even Peiper, later questioned about the Malmedy massacre, gave testimony that revealed how deeply fuel had shaped every decision. After December 17th, he said, "Everything was dictated by fuel. We could not maneuver, we could not pursue, and we could not retreat properly. The Americans moved freely while we counted leaders." General Heinz Guderian wrote, "When Peiper captured 50,000 gallons, which meant everything to him and nothing to the Americans, the war was already over." The story endures because it marks the moment when industrial warfare reached its final conclusion. Wars were no longer decided by courage, heroism, or even tactical brilliance alone. They were decided by production statistics. The romantic image of warfare died in the Ardennes among empty fuel tanks. Historian Richard Overy calculated that by 1944 production ratio between the Allies and the Axis exceeded 5-1 in most major categories. In petroleum, it approached 50-1. No amount of training, discipline, or tactical skill could overcome such disparities. During the war, America produced 324,750 aircraft. Germany produced about 119,000. Americans built 88,410 tanks. Germany built 46,857. But most telling of all, America refined 1.8 billion barrels of oil in 1944 alone, while Germany struggled to gather 33 million. December 24, 1944. As Peiper's men slipped through American lines on foot, abandoning 39 tanks, 70 half-tracks, and 177 other vehicles, the full magnitude of their discovery crystallized. They had captured 50,000 gallons of fuel, something that seemed miraculous at the time, only to learn that it was meaningless to an enemy who could afford to burn millions. Weber reflected in 1975. That morning at Hansfeld, when we found the American fuel, we celebrated as if we had won the lottery. By evening, after learning about the burning at Stavelot, we understood we had already lost. The Americans had so much that they could destroy what we would have died to possess. Those 50,000 gallons were less than what a single American armored division consumed in 2 days, less than what the Red Ball Express burned in 3 hours. A rounding error in Allied daily fuel consumption. Major General J. Lawton Collins later wrote, "The German attempt to capture fuel revealed their greatest miscalculation. They assumed we valued fuel as they did, as something irreplaceable. They could not understand that we had so much we could burn millions rather than risk a tactical disadvantage. Operation Watch on the Rhine failed because of the immutable mathematics of industrial warfare. The German offensive consumed approximately 2.8 million gallons of fuel, about 40% of its total allocation, most of it coming from captured supplies. During the same period, the Americans consumed 267 million gallons, nearly 100 times more. The Wehrmacht lost 100,000 men, 800 tanks, and 1,000 aircraft. But the most devastating loss was not measured in equipment or casualties. It was a loss of illusion. Every German who witnessed American abundance understood that Germany was not truly fighting a war anymore, but participating in its own execution. Joachim Peiper survived the Ardennes only to spend years in prison for war crimes, remaining incarcerated until 1956. On July 14, 1976, he was murdered at his home in France by unknown assailants. Yet in 1967, he told historian Henry Lehman something that revealed how deeply Hansfeld had marked him. Finding that depot was the worst thing. If we had run out of fuel earlier, we might have retreated with some dignity. Instead, we discovered that the Americans had oceans, and we had drops. We discovered impossibility. The lesson went far beyond the Second World War. In industrial warfare, logistics outweighed tactics. Production overwhelmed courage. Abundance defeated dedication. The German soldier of 1944 was often better trained, more experienced, and more hardened by combat. It did not matter. The Americans were backed by an industrial machine that could waste more than Germany could ever hope to produce. That truth was written into every jerrycan at Hansfeld, every gallon burned at Stavelot, and every pipeline stretching across France. Wars between industrial powers would no longer be decided by brilliant generals or heroic charges, but by factories, refineries, and transport networks. Colonel Trevor Dupuy calculated that in December 1944, each American soldier was supported by 67 pounds of supplies per day. Each German soldier received just 3 pounds. Americans complained about waste. Germans would have considered American waste unimaginable abundance. In 1984, 40 years after the battle, veterans gathered at Gleize. The museum still displayed Peiper's Tiger tank, standing exactly where it had run out of fuel on December 23, 1944. Former Unteroffizier Karl Wortmann stood beside it with former Staff Sergeant Roy Anderson of the U.S. 30th Infantry Division. "We always wondered why you stopped," Anderson said. "We thought it was tactical." Wortmann laughed, but there was no humor in it. "We stopped because our tanks were empty. You burned millions just to keep it from us. How could we fight that?" Anderson was silent for a moment, then said quietly, "We never knew you were that short. We had so much, we never even thought about it." That exchange captured the truth of December 1944. One side measured fuel by the gallon. the other by the millions. One fought for each jerry can, the other burned oceans. The outcome was never truly in doubt. German records themselves provided the most damning evidence. Army Group B's war diary for December 1944 read, like a chronicle of inevitable collapse. December 16th, offensive begins. Fuel at 70% of minimum. December 17th, Peiper captures 50,000 gallons. December 18th, multiple depots destroyed. Over 5 million gallons lost. December 19th, fuel critical, units immobilized. December 24th, Peiper abandons vehicles. Fuel exhaustion. Meanwhile, the 1st U.S. Army reported, December 16th, reserves at 3.7 million gallons. December 17th, 2.2 million gallons destroyed. December 18th, 1.8 million gallons received. December 24th, reserves at 4.1 million gallons. Americans treated millions of gallons with indifference. Germans treated individual cans like treasure. Beyond sheer quantity, American fuel represented technological superiority. American refineries have perfected catalytic cracking, producing higher-octane fuel more efficiently than Germany's hydrogenation plants ever could. American 100-octane aviation fuel gave their aircraft performance advantages over German planes forced to rely on 87-octane synthetic fuel. The Americans had mastered additives that Germany could not replicate: tetraethyl lead, ethylene dibromide, advanced detergents. Ironically, German engines, designed for lower-quality fuel, sometimes ran poorly on captured American gasoline. Fuel shortages shaped every aspect of the German soldiers' experience. Gefreiter Hans Muller recorded on December 20th, marched 30 kilometers, no fuel for trucks, past abandoned American vehicles with engines running to keep warm. They leave engines running. We march through snow. Medical services were crippled. Ambulances could not evacuate the wounded. Hospitals could not run generators. Men died, waiting for transport that never came. Aberar's Dr. Wilhelm Kirsting later testified, "We had excellent surgeons and medical supplies captured from the Americans, but no fuel for ambulances. Men died who could have been saved with a 10-kilometer journey." The discoveries shattered German propaganda about American weakness. Soldiers have been taught that Americans were soft, decadent, incapable of sustained effort. Then they discovered an enemy who could destroy more in a day than Germany possessed in a month. Goebbels' diary on December 28th recorded, "Reports indicate serious morale problems. Soldiers write about American superiority, undermining our narrative. But stories traveled faster than censorship ever could. The myth of German superiority could not survive contact with American logistics. The failure in the Ardennes meant Germany had no options left except desperate defense." General Alfred Jodl testified at Nuremberg, "After the Ardennes, we knew it was lost. We had played our last card and discovered the enemy held all the aces." Recognizing Germany's desperation, the Allies intensified their focus on fuel production. By February 1945, German fuel output had effectively ceased. The Luftwaffe was grounded. Pilot training was canceled. The Wehrmacht became static, destroyed piece by enemies who could move freely. The spring of 1945 brought surreal scenes. German units surrendered not because they were defeated in battle, but because they were immobilized. Entire panzer divisions sat helplessly while Allied forces drove past them. General Major Fritz Bohm described it. "We had 42 operational tanks, experienced crews, and ammunition. We had 300 liters of fuel, not enough to reach the next town. We destroyed our tanks and walked into captivity." Meanwhile, the American advance was limited only by traffic jams created by the abundance of vehicles. Patton's Third Army alone operated more than 15,000 vehicles. Camp Peiper's fuel crisis had become a perfect demonstration of how industrial capacity determined the outcome of the Second World War. When Peiper stood among the captured jerry cans that morning at Hansfeld, he had glimpsed the truth. They were fighting an enemy whose waste exceeded their need. The numbers told the entire story. Germany's total fuel allocation for the offensive was 5 million gallons. Fuel deliberately destroyed by the Americans exceeded 8 million gallons. Daily American consumption stood at 7.5 million gallons. Peiper's great victory at Hansfeld. The capture of 50,000 gallons amounted to just 0.6% of a single day of American fuel supply. The Battle of the Bulge killed 19,000 Americans and perhaps 100,000 Germans. It shattered the Wehrmacht's last operational reserves. But its most lasting impact was not written in casualties or destroyed tanks. It was written in understanding. It spread through German ranks that America possessed an abundance beyond comprehension. Peiper's discovery was not only about fuel, it was about the true nature of industrial warfare. Victory belonged to whoever could produce the most petroleum, steel, and aluminum. Germany never truly had a chance. The final irony came when American forces cataloged the abandoned German equipment at Gleize. They found 39 perfectly intact tanks, abandoned solely because there was no fuel. Major Robert Harrison's salvage report stated, fuel required, 8,000 gallons. Classification, minimal. Source, local reserve. Time required, for hours. What had been impossible for Germans, finding 8,000 gallons to save their most powerful tanks, was beneath American notice. It was a minor logistical request, drawn from local reserves, yet it exceeded the peak fuel strength of Camp Peiper. This was the true meaning of Hansfeld, not simply that America had more fuel, but that American abundance operated on a scale that made German scarcity irrelevant. The war was effectively decided the moment American industrial capacity was fully mobilized. Hansfeld merely revealed what had already been true since 1942. Germany was fighting the impossible, measuring defeat in gallons, while America measured victory in oceans. Today, the Tiger tank still sits in a museum at Gleize, its fuel gauge frozen on empty. It stands as a monument to the moment when tactical excellence collided with logistical reality and lost. Visitors ask why such powerful machines were abandoned. The answer is simple. There was no fuel. If this story helped you see the hidden forces that truly decide wars, then you're already part of what we do here on World War Lab. Don't forget to subscribe, leave a like, and support the channel. Your engagement helps us keep uncovering the real history behind the battles.